Kirsten Evans is here now from IDC. Kirsten, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you very much for having me, Sheila. I appreciate it.
That was such a powerful conference, Kirsten. It's I have it not only recorded, but I was sitting there taking copious notes, and there were times I couldn't write. I had to just look up and listen. Well, I was watching the whole time, but the panel you were on, that was really tough. Your panel, Christian and Yazidi Women and Girls, Sexual Victims of Crimes Against Humanity. The young Yazidi woman, that was so hard to listen to. And there were times, Kristen, where I felt like I had to leave the hall and catch my breath. And at the same time, I thought, if children, women, girls have to suffer this, then we have to sit here and hear their witness, their testimony. Talk about that and the power of that witness and why. And she seemed to bury her face so frequently and talking about it in tears. And then it seemed to me also, Kirsten, that at times she was burying her face in shame. And yet there she was in the United Nations giving this witness. She did so for what? For all of those who are nameless and voiceless and faceless on the other side of the world. And she had to be their face and their voice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You said that very well, Sheila. Especially the point that you just made of burying her face in shame, right? Isn't that one of the horrible and the most tragic ironies of sexual violence like that, is that the victim, of course, having no responsibility whatsoever because of the nature of the crime, still bears on top of the emotional and the physical and the psychological abuse that they have had to endure this sense of shame, which we all know is irrational and yet is so human. And you could see that in her face as she spoke. I've seen that in the face of other women who have returned and escaped from the ISIS sex slave trade. When recently in Erbil, Iraq, at some of the refugee camps there, there's this horrible and heartbreaking sense of shame that and this heart-wrenching reality when you realize that how these women are going to be able to put their lives back together after having endured something like this. So, yes, the young woman who was with me on that panel, as you know, and I think I'll go ahead and say her name because it's public on all of the documents. Samia Selman. She's able to go through the refugee process, and she's now settled in Germany, so she's no longer in the region. But she's 15 years old, and at the age of 13, she was kidnapped by ISIS. She's a Yazidi young woman, and when ISIS ravaged through the area of the Nineveh Plain, which is the largely historically Yazidi area, which is the Mount Sinjar area, she was one of thousands of young girls that was stolen from their families, abducted, and then had to live a nightmare that really few of us can imagine. And she shared with us very poignantly and very movingly some of her own personal experiences and also just the experiences of her community at large while she was there with us speaking at the United Nations on Thursday and on Saturday.
And then after she spoke, I mean, there were a couple of times, Kirsten, that day, with all the powerful speakers all day on the different panels, there were a couple of times that those of us in the hall, the chamber, the attendees, were on our feet, giving applause, if you will, to support. One was in the parents of Kayla Mueller. We can talk about that. And this young Yazidi girl, to give her whatever support we could, to say, we, the world community, are here, hearing you and supporting you, and we want the world to know that. And then on this very important panel you were on, then Jacqueline Isaac, I hope that's how you pronounce her name, is an American-Egyptian humanitarian attorney and vice president of Roads of Success, gave a very powerful talk as well. Very powerful, and she called it, I forget the term for it. I didn't write it down because I was so riveted listening to her, but it was something, speaking of these sexual victims of crimes against humanity, Kirsten, it was something about generational crimes against even the reproductive ability for them to reproduce themselves and then have a
Mm,
future. So when you feel
absolutely.
hopeless and like you don't have a future, that's one thing. But when ISIS has, or any other terrorist group has literally taken away your ability to reproduce and have a future, that's such a crime against humanity. It's a crime certainly that calls out to God. But talk about that for a moment. Jacqueline's testimony on this was powerful in the sexual violence and the sexual crimes against humanity in these girls and young women and even children.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, absolutely, Sheila. So, as you know, the conference was broken up into different panels of different topics, all of which having to do with
Mm,
the question of the genocide of religious minorities, including Christians and others under ISIS. And this particular panel, as you mentioned, focused on the use of sexual violence as an instrument of genocide. And that's a very important panel because it's a very important topic because we don't often or we don't always think about systematic sexual violence as being a method of genocide. Of course, we think about it as being a great atrocity and clearly a crime against humanity. But when we talk about genocide, we usually traditionally kind of tend to think of mass execution and mass killing, which of course is very much and always will be a part of the methodology of genocide. As you mentioned, Jacqueline spoke on that panel discussing some of the other victims that she has had the opportunity to interview and to advocate for, both here in the United States and abroad. We also had Dr. Elise von Joden-Forgy from Stockton University,
right.
who
I
is
think she's the one
herself,
who brought this up. Yes.
yeah, who is herself a genocide scholar and has done specific work in this area. And I thought it was very, very well presented and very well said, where she said that this kind of a crime, this abduction of an entire generation of girls, stories that come out of Iraq and Syria, where ISIS has prevailed and has occupied the territories. The stories are so frequently the same. They come into the communities. They separate the men from the women. To the men, they give a couple of options, right? Convert to Islam, I'd like to say convert to their version of Islam. Convert to their version of
Mm-hmm.
Islam, join them, or if they're lucky at times, they're given an opportunity to escape. But oftentimes it's either that question or life or death. And for the young boys, oftentimes the boys are stolen and they're taken away and they're enlisted into the ISIS army, into the ISIS forces. And then the women and the girls, they separate to the other side. And they're treated very differently, horrifically, right? So many of the stories
Mm-hmm.
are that older women of a certain age will almost categorically just be executed because they're not
Mm-hmm.
seen as having any real value or any worth. And then the younger women, going down to girls and even children, um, are separated and categorized according to their beauty, according to their perceived health, according to their age, um, according to their desirability, right? And these girls are then put onto the sex slave trade. And the report that you mentioned that we published with the Knights of Columbus, one of the pieces of evidence that we submitted to the State Department was, in fact, price menus that ISIS has published in their territory for their own soldiers of prices of how much it costs them to buy a Yazidi girl or a Christian girl. The prices are divided up according to ages, right? A child costs this much. A sort of young adolescent girl is the peak. As they get older, they're a little bit less expensive, et cetera. So there's a gradation of
Horrifying.
prices according to, and there's also a price distinction according to their assessment of beauty. But one of the things that Dr. Jordan Forgy was saying was that this is a particular weapon of genocide because it is meant to drive right at the heart of any ethnic community's
Mm-hmm.
social bonds and civilization, its capacity to maintain the healthy social bonds that allow a community to have longevity and to have prosperity. And so It is, first of all, of course, a horrific physical, psychological, and emotional abuse to the women, girls, and children that have to endure this. It is the gravest of humiliation to their husbands, to, to their fathers, to their sons, the stories
Mm-hmm.
of which often tell us how they are forced to be present while their mothers, their sisters, their grandmothers, their daughters, their wives are abused. So they're forced
This
to
has
watch
to.
this.
Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. And this is what got reported on different days throughout this 3-day conference. But we heard it at the UN.